Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Vicky Wilkins, Dean of the School of Public Affairs at American University. I'm so glad that you've joined us today for what I'm sure will be an exciting conversation about the current situation in Afghanistan. If you know anything about the School of Public Affairs at AU, you know that we pride ourselves on pulling together scholars from both practice and academia. And today we have a perfect example of that. I'm about to introduce a faculty member from our school, but before I do, I want to let you know that after our conversation, we will open up to questions from you. You can enter your questions not through some other function, but right into the comments in Facebook, and we'll take them from there and ask Professor Bacon those questions. So let me introduce who I'll be speaking with today. Tricia Bacon is an associate professor in the School of Public Affairs, Department of Justice Law and Criminology. She focuses her research on extremism, terrorist group behavior and decision-making, and U.S. counterterrorism policy. As I mentioned, she has an expertise and background far beyond her academic time. Prior to joining AU, Professor Bacon was a senior counterterrorism analyst for South Asia at the U.S. State Department from 2008 to 2013. Since leaving government, she has done extensive field research in the region, including Afghanistan. And I always like to share that just 2 summers ago, I received several calls from our university's risk management asking me if I knew where Professor Bacon was or where she was headed. And they were very concerned because she was spending time in Kabul doing research and interviewing folks. And so they wanted to make sure that I knew where she was and had a good idea about when she would return. So Tricia, welcome, and thank you so much for being here today. I appreciate you answering the call when I said, can we have a conversation where you can share with others your expertise and knowledge of these issues?
Glad to do it. Thanks for being here with me, Vicki.
Yes. So I just wanted to start by getting your description of what you think the situation is currently in Kabul and how Kabul maybe compares to the rest of Afghanistan and what's going on outside of the city.
I think we have a situation in Afghanistan now where we almost have 3 tiers of locations. And the first tier are the places that the Taliban already controlled and has controlled for months, if not years. Before the US withdrawal, the Taliban controlled most of the rural areas in Afghanistan. So for those individuals, not a lot has changed. They've been living under Taliban rule for a time, and nothing really has changed about their circumstances. And then we have this second tier of places where you had contested control. You had the Taliban and the government both vying for control. Those are the places where we've seen the government effectively dissipate. So those populations had some exposure to the Taliban and have some ability to navigate how the Taliban operates, but they have experienced a significant change with the absence of the Afghan government. And then we have this third tier of places, and these are the provincial capitals, and this is Kabul. And these are the places that the government fairly firmly controlled before the withdrawal. And now the Taliban has come in essentially as military conquerors. And these are the places where we're really seeing the most desperation, the most fear, the most disappointment, and a sense of panic with people trying to figure out what their next move will be, whether they're going to leave the country, whether they're going to try to flee. A lot of people have gone into hiding. And I think that those are the places, especially the images that we see coming out of Kabul, where the situation is the most acute, because these were the people who were most invested in the US-led order in Afghanistan and who stand to lose the most, including their lives, now that the Taliban has taken control.
Yeah, thank you for that. And you talk about the dissipation of the government and the conquering of the Taliban. And I'm kind of curious about the speed at which this happened. And do you think it was possible for US policymakers to know and understand how quickly things could turn and the Taliban would gain control over so much of the country?
That is a key question right now. And I've been working on Afghanistan since 2008. And what I can say is, for most Afghan watchers, the ultimate outcome, once the US decided it was going to withdraw before there was a settlement between the Afghan government and the Taliban, the outcome of a Taliban victory was never really in question. The question was the timing of it. So yes, I think it was a more rapid collapse than some would predict, although probably there were those who would have said weeks rather than days. But I don't think the outcome itself was a surprise. But as you say, the speed of it was, and it's clear that the speed of it surprised the US government, because when you look at the size of the US embassy presence, when you look at the state of the evacuation plans, you can see that the US government thought that it had at least some more time than it did. But as I say, there was really no question once the US decided to withdraw, and that there had not really been meaningful progress in the talks between the Afghan government and the Taliban, that this was the likely outcome. I think there were some variables that were particularly surprising. There were sort of strong men that the Afghan government has relied on who go back decades. And a lot of them, there was at least a belief they would be able to muster some militia, some force, in addition to the Afghan security forces. And a lot of those strong men have turned out to be straw men. They have not really been able to develop any kind of meaningful opposition. Some of them have fled, some of them have defected. And so some of the buffers that the US was probably relying on turned out to not really be obstacles once the Taliban gained momentum. And I think the hard part about this outcome is there's so many failures that led to it that there's ample actors to point fingers at one another. We've been doing this for 20 years, right? So there have been both Democrat and Republican presidents who have made strategic policy mistakes that have led us to where we are today. The US can point at Pakistan and Iran for supporting the Taliban, and Pakistan and Iran point to the US for not building a viable Afghan government in the 2 decades it was there. And we can look at the Afghan security forces and criticize them for not standing up and fighting, and they would return and say, you built an army that relies on your support. And when you withdrew that, we were not able to viably fight this force that was gaining so much momentum. And the problem with all these accusations is they all have some truth to them. This failure has so many actors who contributed in some way, shape, or form to get us to the point that we're at today, that, as I say, the outcome itself should not be a surprise, but undoubtedly that it occurred so quickly took the US government and even seasoned analysts off guard.
That's interesting. And as we see the Taliban now, as they're presenting and talking about themselves, we see this kind of change in tone and this desire to have us believe they're a different Taliban than before. But what do you think we can expect from the Taliban rule at this point in time? And what will stay the same? What might be different than what we've seen before?
I think that is the big question. And I have been amongst those that's been a little bit slow to speculate on it overall, because I think we want to judge the Taliban based on their behavior. But I do think we have to keep in mind that the Taliban has come to power by winning militarily. It didn't come to power in a power sharing agreement as a political settlement, the kinds of things that would have a natural moderating effect on the group's power. It has come to basically total control through military means. And thus there are going to be significant portions of the group that see that the group won this fight militarily and are fully prepared now to impose their vision as they have seen it. There's not a lot that will restrain them in that way. I think the one factor that's worth keeping in mind is one of the ways that the Taliban has changed, it's not really its ideology, it's its sort of worldliness and how savvy it is at international messaging. What we see now is that the Taliban knows what kinds of message to deliver to the international community to sort of assuage some concerns, to be vague enough that it's not clear what it's going to do. And it's pretty effective at that kind of messaging. And in some cases, it's delivering messages to the international community that sound reassuring on their face, even though we see the exact opposite happening on the ground. So I think that one of the things to watch is how much its international rhetoric starts to line up with its behavior, because right now there is a discrepancy between those two things. And that, I think, is a real source of concern when it comes to the issues that are really important to the United States.
Thank you for that. I think because of your expertise, I'm curious how you think that the Taliban's relationship with foreign militants has been affected now by this new takeover and their new power, right? And how will its relations with other governments change given what's gone on in the last week or so?
I think these are really key points to thinking about how the Taliban will operate going forward. The Taliban's always been a little bit of a paradox when we think about its relationships with foreign militants. And that is, the Taliban has never indicated any international aspirations. It has not engaged in terrorism outside of Afghanistan. its political objectives are constrained to Afghanistan. But since its inception, it has had these close relationships with foreign groups that do have ambitions outside of Afghanistan and still have ambitions outside of Afghanistan. And they have fought alongside the Taliban for 20 years in this military victory. And so these relationships are not something that the Taliban is going to be inclined to cease. In fact, the Taliban's been quite clear, is not going to sever relationships with Al-Qaeda or any of these other militant groups. Its pledge is very narrow, and that is that it will not allow Afghanistan to be used as territory for attacks elsewhere. The problem is that's a fundamental tension with the Taliban's willingness to provide safe haven to these organizations. Safe haven is probably one of the most rare and precious commodities that a terrorist organization can have. And there's not a direct line between having safe haven and conducting attacks externally. It requires a variety of other steps. Even 9/11 did. It required a cell in Hamburg and coordination in Southeast Asia. But it is a fundamental tool, a very important one, to be able to plan, to coordinate, and to be able to engage in planning without the fear of counterterrorism action. So the Taliban is making a fairly significant promise that it's not clear that it can entirely fulfill if it's going to provide safe haven to these organizations. There's a real tension there in what it's claiming. But as I say, the Taliban is not interested in these groups engaging in those kinds of actions, but it is unwilling to expel them. And so it has to deal with the tension between those two positions. And then you have sort of this additional piece to it that is also relevant, which is the Taliban's desire for international recognition. That was a major problem for the Taliban in the 1990s, and it has been pretty transparent that it wants international recognition. So of course, a terrorist attack externally that can be traced back to Afghanistan will hinder its ability to get that kind of recognition. Having said that, the Taliban is in a much stronger international position now than it was during the 1990s. Of course, it's had longstanding relationships with its neighbors, Iran and Pakistan, and has close relationships with both of those governments. We see the Central Asian neighbors are trying to basically find a modus vivendi with the Taliban at this point. We don't see that they're putting up significant resistance or encouraging opposition. They seem to want to find a way to live with the Taliban being in power in Afghanistan. And probably most notably in some respects is that we see China and Russia making moves and engaging in talking points that suggest they want to have productive relationships with the Taliban and gloating at the US failure essentially in Afghanistan. So the US and the West has less leverage with the Taliban in part because it's getting international recognition and international acceptance in these other realms. And so that is going to be one of the difficulties US policy is going to have going forward, is trying to put forward sufficient carrots and sticks to help moderate the Taliban's behavior, especially when it comes to foreign militant groups, when it has all these other international partners.
Interesting. It's interesting to think about how that will shape their behaviors, of course, too, because we know how important that is. I have one more topic with Tricia, and I want to make sure everybody knows if you're just joining that you can write your questions in the comments, and we're going to get to those soon. I was curious in particular about one group, and that is the Islamic State faction in Afghanistan. And I was curious how you might think they would react and respond to the Taliban's takeover of the country.
This is a really interesting dynamic. So I talked about the foreign militant groups that the Taliban has alliances with. Well, this is a very different animal. The Islamic State in Khorasan, as it's known, ISK, is essentially a rival of the Taliban. It has a very different dynamic than the foreign militant groups like Al-Qaeda. And for its part, the Islamic State in Khorasan probably, arguably, is just as opposed to a Taliban-led order as it was to a US-backed one. This is not an improvement in circumstances as far as ISK is concerned. So it is really going to try to be a spoiler and to disrupt the Taliban's consolidation of power and control. It's going to do that probably through what it's done in the past, which are these mass casualty, very indiscriminate style attacks. It has been very willing to target civilians or allow civilians to be collateral damage. And when we see the threat reporting coming out now that it's seeking to strike around the airport before the US withdrawal, I would imagine that's the kind of attack that it would be likely to try to undertake. But this isn't a group that can take territory from the Taliban or, consolidate control over major swaths of the country. It will operate probably much more as a conventional terrorist organization, if you will. And it's one that the Taliban, frankly, in the United States share as an enemy. We've reached sort of this strange point where we share enemies. And it's also a group that worries Russia and Iran and some of the other powers in the region. So it is one area where there is a common concern about the terrorist threat. But I think that ISK we're going to see an escalation actually in its violence as it tries to disrupt the Taliban's consolidation of control and embarrass the United States on its way out the door.
So here's a good question that comes from that, and that is, who could challenge the Taliban? Is there any groups currently within Afghanistan with the US pulling out and the government dissipating, as you say? Are there any groups left that could actually challenge them in their run of the country?
That's a situation that looks pretty grim right now. We do have an area in the north known as the Panjshir Valley, which was a solid anti-Taliban location in the 1990s and was the core of what the US supported in overthrowing the Taliban. So we have seen some efforts to consolidate some resistance in the Panjshir Valley, led by the vice president of the previous government and former intelligence chief, Amarullah Saleh. There is an effort underway there also with the son of a legendary commander coming out of that area. I am not optimistic that this opposition will gain traction for a couple of reasons. One, the people who worked for the United States, the Afghans who worked for the United States, are largely and understandably looking to leave the country. And one of the things that results in is a lot of the opposition to the Taliban is going to flee the country rather than stay and fight in what could very well be a bloody and unsuccessful effort. Second, the Panjshir Valley relies on Tajikistan and sort of routes through Tajikistan in order to be a viable bastion of opposition. And what we're seeing is that Tajikistan appears to be leaning towards making some kind of, as I say, modus vivendi with the Taliban rather than instigating it by allowing opposition. So the Northern Alliance, as we once thought of it, is sort of this core opposition to the Taliban that it was during the 1990s. And then, of course, after 9/11, is really a shadow of what it once was. So I don't think that we see any viable opposition movement at this time. And I'm not sure there's much appetite on the US side for supporting an opposition movement to the Taliban, especially when the Taliban is as formidable as it is at this time. So I think that those prospects are pretty weak at this moment, unless there is a more indigenous resistance that rises up within Afghanistan.
You said it might be a little pessimistic. So you warned us. You did warn us. Good question. Another good question from the audience. Do you think Russia is refusing to accept refugees as a move to get closer and work with the Taliban?
Yeah, I think what we're going to see right now is that Russia undertaking a variety of measures that poke the United States in the eye and try to cozy up to the Taliban enough that it can have a productive relationship with the Taliban. Probably not an extensive one, but a largely positive one. And so I think that that's exactly what Russia's calculation is here, is another way to sort of show the US, point out the US failure. And the Taliban has now publicly said that it's not going to allow any more Afghans to leave. And then there's been some subsequent lack of clarity about that statement. But the point is that the Taliban doesn't want to allow all Afghans to flee the way they are, especially people who are skilled, like doctors and some of the people, humanitarian workers, those kinds of things, which frankly they will need. So I think Russia is sort of courting the Taliban as well as trying to take an opportunity to once again poke the United States in the eye.
Yeah, no, I think that's interesting. And I think, that's what we're seeing play, given your time and experience in Kabul, that scene outside the airport and thinking how, it would be very difficult for people to get through to take a flight and get out, it looks like. So
you can't get into the airport right now without going through Taliban checkpoints.
Yeah.
And so foreigners have been able to get through to some extent, but even just sort of the massive crowds, it makes it very difficult. But if the Taliban is now even creating ambiguity about that, people will be more fearful about trying to go through those checkpoints. And so even if it's not going to enforce that, the fact that it said it has probably frightened enough people into preventing them from trying to get to the airport, and fears that the Taliban will arrest them or detain them or even harm them on the spot. And we have seen a number of reports that the Taliban is hunting for former Afghan government officials and people who work for the United States. There's been reports of it going house to house with lists and knowing where people who worked for the government are. So those very same people, it is a tall order for them to then try to go through a Taliban checkpoint to get to the airport.
Another question from the audience. Do you anticipate the US-Pakistan relationship changing as a result of this withdrawal?
I think the US-Pakistan relationship is changing for a number of reasons, but this is one. The US relationship with Pakistan has been heavily shaped by the United States' need for grounds of lines of control and air lines of control going into Afghanistan. So essentially, the United States has relied on Pakistan to execute its war in Afghanistan. So removing that dynamic, of course, immediately changes the incentive structure. In addition to that, Pakistan has consistently gotten closer to China. And so that, of course, is something that will factor into the US view of Pakistan going forward. Pakistan is in a difficult position, despite essentially getting the outcome it's been supporting for a number of years and supporting the Taliban. Now that it's gotten this outcome, it faces some challenges. It's going to have a major refugee crisis on its hands. And it also has the most influence of any foreign actor on the Taliban. But the more external relations the Taliban has, the less responsive it is to Pakistan, because it doesn't rely on Pakistan anymore. And if it has its own emirate, as it calls it, in Afghanistan, it doesn't rely on safe haven in Pakistan either. So Pakistan has lost quite a bit of its leverage over the Taliban, and it has its own sort of foreign policy concerns that it needs to deal with the Afghan Taliban in power as well. So we are in for a difficult period of US-Pakistan relations, I think, as well, because the US will want Pakistan to push the Taliban on some things that are our concerns, whereas Pakistan will deny that it has that kind of leverage. And to the degree that it has leverage, it wants to use it for its own concerns. So this has always been a very fraught relationship, and I think it will continue to be fraught, but for different reasons and with different dynamics going on.
Wow, that's very interesting. Here's a combined question from the audience. What are the implications of the Taliban-run Afghanistan on US national security? And does this mean that the US should scale back promoting democracy throughout the world? Those are two pretty tough questions, but what do you think this means for our national security, and what does this mean for our efforts to promote democracy around the world?
For the first question, I think this is a real conundrum in terms of national security. And the reason why I say that is there is a desire and a reason for the United States to shift away from its 20-year post 9/11 mode of focusing on terrorism as the top national security concern. And the desire to focus on near peer, great competition, that is now the primary national security concern. And I think there's validity to that shift. I think what's difficult about that is the degree to which we want to deprioritize countering terrorism, because the adversary gets a vote, right? And we just had a major jihadist victory, one that will motivate and excite the jihadist movement all over the world. This is a victory on par with the Soviet withdrawal from Afghanistan in 1989, which was a seminal event in the movement. And so I think the change in prioritization makes sense, but the United States has to continue to counter this kind of extremism, because it has not shown any sign of abating, even though we want to change our national security priorities. So my position would be, yes, prioritize China and Russia. Those are existential level threats to the United States in a lot of ways, but we have to be able to have multiple priorities at the same time, and they're not entirely conflicting ones. There is some complementarity between the desire to compete with Russia and China and counterterrorism. They don't have to be a zero-sum kind of approach. I think on democracy promotion, that is a very difficult question. And one of the things that I would say is we always run the risk of over extrapolating from one foreign policy experience. And undoubtedly, what has happened in Afghanistan is a tremendous failure on multiple levels, including democracy promotion. But I don't think that all of the factors that led to the failure in Afghanistan are relevant in other places. In fact, Afghanistan is sort of unique in the level of US involvement in erecting the political institutions and the type of government and a lot of those kinds of factors. The US was so heavily involved there. Probably the only analogy could be Iraq. But other than that, the United States democracy promotion efforts don't involve that same kind of military investment, building from scratch of political institutions. So I don't think that what happened in Afghanistan is sort of indictment of democracy promotion. It's maybe an indictment of this kind of approach to democracy promotion.
No, I think the chilling effect might be that we think through that, but you're right. Democracy promotion doesn't always look the same, and we need to be mindful of how we're doing that. I'm waiting for the last question to come in, so we'll get that in just a second. But I'm curious, you're someone who travels there. You have an invested research interest in the area. How do you feel about, will you be able to go back? How do you feel about the prospects of continuing to work with the organizations and people you've been involved with there?
That is a question that's weighing heavily on me, is that I see a lot of the Afghans that I worked with and who were very important to me personally and important to my work, sort of frantically leaving the country. Some of them have succeeded, some of them have not, and are in hiding and have been threatened and are really in a very difficult situation right now. And it brings home this crisis, which can feel a little bit far away when you just watch the news, very acutely for me. And I'm very worried about those individuals. I am committed to getting back to Afghanistan when I can, but I don't really know how that will look right now. I think it's a really big question mark on a lot of levels, but I will say here that I am committed to getting back when I can.
Well, do know that risk management will call me, and I might be a little less likely for a while to say that's okay. But I think this should be our last question. We kind of hinted at this, but what do you think about the long-term outcomes in Afghanistan? Is this now a Taliban-run country? Is this going to be something that we're living with for years and years to come? What do you expect to see there?
Yes, I think we are going to see a Taliban-led country. I do think that governing is hard in ways that are different than running an insurgency. I think the Taliban has a difficult road ahead. A lot of the shadow governance that it provided when it was an insurgent group actually came through the international assistance. It would tax things that were part of international assistance, or humanitarian organizations operating in its area. It managed and controlled them, but they were funded by the international assistance. So it's going to, if it's not able to get international assistance because of opposition to its rule, especially the way that it rules, it's going to face a lot of those kinds of challenges. It's going to face challenges of a population that at least a subset of the population had become to embrace aspects of the post-2001 order. And it's going to face those kinds of tensions with the local community. So in a way, I think for the Taliban, the last 20 years have, of course, been a very grueling insurgency, but it has a whole new set of challenges ahead of it that it's not necessarily prepared for by having been effective at shadow governance and at insurgency.
It's a great point to end on. I want to thank you again for jumping at this opportunity. I really do appreciate it. I knew that people would value hearing your expertise and knowledge, and I appreciate the work you always have done there and the way you bring it here to American University and with our students. It truly is remarkable. So I thank everybody for joining us. It's been a great conversation. Please stay tuned. School of Public Affairs is looking to host several of these conversations. Hope you can tune in to more of them, and just thank you. And please, everybody, stay well and take care. So thank you, Tricia.
Thank you, Vicki.